Good morning, y'all. Hope y'all are well on this Monday. We've talked about the American economy, how it was based largely on slave labor, and how it even encouraged slave labor. But we're talking about reform movements today, because there were many people in the U.S. who realized that slavery was harmful. A reformer is somebody who wants to change society for the better. And one of the most important reform movements was the movement to reform or abolish slavery. People argued slavery was harmful for a variety of reasons. The first reason was that slaves were treated as chattel. Chattel just means property. And in the US, we had what was called chattel slavery. It was a very harsh form of slavery where men, women, and children were bought and sold. They were treated just like cattle, horses, wagons, and oftentimes families were split up. People also argued slavery was harmful because it was evil, and in effect, it created corruption in American society. And if we look at B, what reform or reforms were attempted? Well, in this case with slavery, reformers wanted to abolish slavery. Abolish, that's a key word here, and it has a couple different forms, so let's go over those. So, abolition is a noun. So if you wanted to abolish slavery, you were pro-abolition. Again, abolish is the verb, so you would say, I want to abolish slavery. And one who wants to abolish slavery is an abolitionist. That's a person. So B, reformers wanted to abolish slavery. Now it's important to note under B that there were different types of abolition. There was immediate abolition, people wanted slavery to end now, and there was gradual abolition. We'll look at some groups that wanted immediate and some groups that wanted gradual. So let's move to C. Who were the key reformers? Well, one group who wanted immediate abolition of slavery were the Quakers. That's under C in your notes. The Quakers were a devout religious Christian group who mainly lived in Pennsylvania. If you've ever had Quaker cereal or Quaker oatmeal and you see that Quaker man on the box, same people. The Quakers thought that slavery was wrong and immoral, and they wanted it to end immediately. And they wrote letters, they visited Congress. Even Quaker women were very active in politics in a time when women really weren't encouraged to be active in politics. So the Quakers wanted immediate end to slavery. Now, the second group you see on your notes, the American Colonization Society. This group was founded in 1817, and it had a very interesting take on slavery. The American Colonization Society basically wanted a gradual end to slavery. And the way they were going to do this was to gradually free slaves across the South and to pay those slave owners back for their lost property. And what's more, the American Colonization Society then wanted to take those freed slaves and transport them back to Africa. Because even though this society believed that slavery was wrong, they still believed that blacks were inferior to whites and therefore should move back to Africa. This society, when it came about in 1817, it had moderate popularity. However, it died out for several reasons. One, it was really expensive to pay back these slave owners. As I mentioned earlier last week, slaves were really expensive. They were worth a lot of money. They were a person's most valuable piece of property. And two, most slaves by the 1820s, they didn't want to go back to Africa. They had already been there for generations. So rather than being African, these slaves began to think of themselves as African American. They say, even though we're enslaved here, we're still Americans. This is our home now. And we'll see this thinking later on in history when we read some famous abolitionists, which brings us to our final group under C, those abolitionists. And we're going to talk about a few main abolitionists. You've probably heard of these folks before. Again, an abolitionist wants to get rid of slavery. First group we're going to talk about are black abolitionists. Who are these people? Well, David Walker was one. Sojourner Truth was another woman. Frederick Douglass was also a very prominent abolitionist. We'll study him later. So first, David Walker. David Walker wrote The Appeal, which basically encouraged slaves to use violent revolt to overthrow their masters. So he was a radical abolitionist, David Walker. Sojourner Truth. Now, she was a black woman, but she had never been a slave. She was born a free woman in New York. However, she argued for an immediate end to slavery, and she used peaceful political means to do that. And finally, Frederick Douglass, probably the most famous black abolitionist. He was born a slave, taught himself to read, gained his freedom, and actually had to live overseas for several years because he was afraid his master might come after him. We'll read more of his arguments later in our class. Also, there were really famous white abolitionists. The most famous, William Lloyd Garrison. He had a very famous newspaper, which we'll read a section from, and he argued for an immediate end to slavery. And also Angelina Grimke. Now, these two white abolitionists were interesting. William Lloyd Garrison was a Northerner. He hated the South's system of slavery, which makes sense, being a Northerner. He thought it was strange, evil, and harmful to America. However, Angelina Grimke, she was born to a rich slave-owning father. So you would think that she would naturally favor slavery. However, from an early age, she realized the evil and the horror of slavery. And so she became a prominent abolitionist. Okay, let's pause there and I'll take any questions. Okay, so let's move on to 2. Slavery has been abolished in America for a long time. However, the working conditions that existed under slavery, they're still present sometimes around the world. Now, while no country in the world officially approves slavery, many workers, especially in Asia, they work under slave-like conditions. So it's important to note that while there is no official slavery in the world, there is still lots of kind of unofficial or under-the-radar slavery. And so the first example, or I guess the best example we'll talk about today, is Apple. iPads, iPhones, and all that lovely technology that we benefit from here in the US. Well, people have to make that stuff. And to make it cheaply, Apple uses Chinese factories and Chinese